Amy, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Can you hear me?
Thanks for having me.
Oh, great. Election day.
Yes.
Excellent. Election day is tomorrow. So if you haven't voted early, make sure you have a plan to get to the polls. It's your constitutional right. And this year, activists are stepping up to make sure nothing can stop you from having your voice heard. My guest today, Amy Spitalnick, the executive director of Integrity First for America, the nonpartisan civil rights nonprofit backing the landmark lawsuit against neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. She is one of the foremost experts on white supremacist violence, here to talk about what they're planning and how we can make sure those plans just remain a fascist fantasy. Amy, thanks for joining us on the program today.
Thanks so much for having me.
For those of us who are unfamiliar with your work, talk about Integrity for America. What's the mission, and what have you been working on lately?
Sure. We are a small civil rights nonprofit that focuses on holding those accountable who threaten the principles of our democracy, which, of course, these days is quite the tall order. So what that translates to in practice is we are supporting a coalition of Charlottesville community members who are suing the 24 neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for what happened in Charlottesville 3 years ago. As we all know, and as we've seen many times since, there were hundreds of white supremacists out in Charlottesville marching, violently attacking a number of people. Our suit specifically takes on the leaders of this movement that orchestrated the violence that happened. And perhaps most notably, the tools and the tactics that they used there 3 years ago have really proven to be a preview or a harbinger of the cycle of violence that's followed. And sadly, especially over the last few months, including the last few days, we see some of the same tools and tactics being used as a means to intimidate voters and otherwise use these white supremacists and other far-right tactics to breed an atmosphere of terror and fear.
Amy,
so important.
Talk about those actual tactics, because I think, we're seeing them. You tweeted out earlier yesterday that violent pro-Trump extremists are terrorizing communities and forcing Democrats to cancel events. This is how fascism works. Talk about the techniques that these groups are using.
Yeah, unfortunately, none of these techniques are new. They're not new for how these groups have operated, and they're not new for terrorism in general. Many of the tactics that they're using are ones we've seen ISIS and Al-Qaeda use, and that's not an accident. These are deliberate terror tactics, and they need to be described as such. These include things like disinformation. So we've seen a number of instances over the last few months of white supremacists and other far-right extremist groups spreading disinformation in hopes of encouraging violence. And of course, around the election, we all know the role disinformation plays both by domestic and foreign actors in seeking to undermine our democracy. We've seen specific intimidation tactics, particularly the use of vehicles, which I think is something that needs far more attention than it's been getting. We saw a few days ago a caravan of Trump trucks try to run a Biden bus off the road in Texas. We've seen over the weekend a number of instances of Trump caravans that had fake stuffed dummies taped to the front of their hoods, meant to illustrate car attacks against protesters. These protesters were labeled as Antifa or Black Lives Matter. And of course, we know that this is not just a fantasy for them that they illustrate in terms of in these car rallies, as we saw over the weekend, but also a very real tactic that they've used, where we've seen an extraordinary increase in car attacks over the last few months targeted at protesters. And now, as we see these Trump supporters seemingly blocking access to poll sites and other blocking roads, as we saw in a number of places in New York and New Jersey yesterday, the use of vehicles in particular is a tactic that I think we should be aware of, understand how it is in many cases used as a deliberate act of terrorism to intimidate people from exercising their votes, and make sure that these extremists are not successful in their efforts, which is, in all of these cases, the intent to undermine our fundamental rights, in this case, the right to vote, through the use of violence and intimidation.
Amy, some of that intimidation is coming directly from, I would imagine, not imagine, but I see from the top. Trump seems to be encouraging this kind of behavior, and the GOP is also amplifying these alleged election fraud accounts, filing over 300 legal actions in 44 states. The SCOTUS is assisting, issuing rulings in Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. This is just getting to what you were talking about in terms of disinformation. It seems a little, how can they possibly be so coordinated here with their disinformation campaigns, unless it is coming from some main organizing operative or group? I mean, Fox News, all the right-wing outlets are spreading the same lies and disinformation.
Look, these are all deeply interconnected trends. We know that the use of disinformation is intended in many cases to fuel violence. And when you hear Trump and his supporters out there talking about supposed voter fraud, we see firsthand how it directly translates to calls for violence by these extremists. One horrifying example, the day after the debate in which Trump told these white supremacists to stand back and stand by, we saw Andrew Anglin, who is perhaps one of the leading neo-Nazis in America. He runs the Daily Stormer, which is one of the most highly trafficked neo-Nazi websites in the world, post about how Trump's comments served as a call for a race war and a civil war. And he specifically cited the fact that Trump expects the election to be stolen from him, citing the various voter fraud, disinformation, and other claims that Trump and his supporters have been pushing for, frankly, years at this point. And so we see firsthand how they're so deeply interconnected. And similarly, we saw this again in the Texas GOP response to the incident there a few days ago, where the chair of the Texas Democratic Party floated a bunch of conspiracy theories related to George Soros, which of course is rooted in one of the oldest anti-Semitic tropes, and other conspiracies related to fake news, to distract and deflect from the fact that Trump supporters tried to violently run a Biden bus off the road in an act of what I think should be considered terror. And so we see over and over again how this disinformation and these conspiracy theories are used to directly fuel violence and then, of course, give tacit or in some cases explicit support to that violence.
People who have been following these websites and the places where the groups talk to each other, they have reported that it is likely that these groups are, the groups are planning to sow discord and civil unrest. Obviously, we're seeing that, and in the days, election day and the days after. Can you talk about the point of that? Is it to stop having every vote counted?
Yeah, the point here is truly intimidation in service of undermining our fundamental civil rights, and this is what these extremists have done over and over again. It's what they did in Charlottesville. The basis of our lawsuit against the leaders of the white supremacist movement is that they, using violence, undermined our plaintiffs' right to peacefully protest by violently attacking them through their racist, violent conspiracy. And we see this over and over again since. The use of violence, whether it be the disinformation, the car and truck parades that we've talked about that have turned increasingly intimidating, or the threat of actual violence on election day at the polls. There was, of course, these supposed Proud Boy messages that were being pushed to voters that Iran apparently was behind. And you see firsthand how these tools and tactics are used specifically to dissuade people from exercising their rights. And so we need to be smart, we need to be careful, but we can't let these extremists intimidate us into not exercising our rights. That's what they want. And the most important way that we could send them back into the shadows where they belong is have a strong showing tomorrow that makes crystal clear that their extremism, their intimidation has no place here. It's not going to go away if Trump loses tomorrow. But by having someone in office who will make very clear what's at stake, very clear that this intimidation and this extremism that has run rampant over the last few years has no place here, and that all of their efforts to intimidate voters from turning out and from exercising their rights are unsuccessful will go a long way towards beating back these extremists into the shadows where they belong.
Let's turn for a moment and talk about, you mentioned foreign powers also seeking to sow discord in the election and post the election. Can you talk more specifically about what you know about that and what we might see coming up?
Well, I think, what I know is probably sadly what we all know, and I suspect much like in 2016, we will learn a lot more after the fact about attempts to use, whether by foreign actors or increasingly these domestic actors that we've been talking about, attempts to use disinformation and other digital tools to undermine the election and our democracy. I think most notably, there have been extensive reports over the last week or so about efforts by Russia and Iran to obtain voter lists, which are technically public, but of course, when you're obtaining them for the purposes that they are, it's not necessarily the same purposes as, say, a canvasser out in Pennsylvania using it to get out the vote. And so when we see, for example, Iran using these lists of voters to hypothetically push these supposed Proud Boy messages, which urge or suggest that there would be violence if people didn't vote for Trump, that is exactly how this all works. And whether it's a foreign actor like Iran or a domestic actor like the many extremist groups and Trump supporters that we've been talking about, it's important to understand what their goals are here, which again is to suppress the vote, intimidate people.
Amy, my understanding is that there was a report, well, not just a report, a news story, this is actually happening, where I believe it's Russian hackers are they were hacking into different hospitals and holding their information for ransom. And it's wreaked havoc across the hospitals that have been hit in our country, and that they are actually planning on, doing more such things with coordinated cyber attacks on different things. The end game. Oh, are you there, Amy? The end game here. Can you hear me? We've been having technical difficulties all day. It's hard to wonder
I can
why.
hear you now.
Okay, great. So my question is that this around the cyber attacks that the hospitals have experienced here from foreign nations and the reports of potential cyber attacks on other things, including the power grid or banking systems, the different things that we've been hearing about. Can you talk a little bit about what their end game is as well? Oh, Amy, I think you're frozen, and I hate to lose the end of this interview. Okay, let's see if we can squeeze it in. Let's see if we can get it in. I'm asking if you could respond to the reports of the cyber attacks on the hospitals by foreign agents, and also the reports that we might be seeing cyber attacks in the coming weeks, especially this coming week, from foreign agents in order to disrupt the recount process that we're likely to have to go through.
Yeah. Look, I think any of these extremists, whether it be foreign actors or domestic, take moments of uncertainty. And this started months ago at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic and has continued through the Black Lives Matter protests this summer. And of course, now around the election and all the various attempts to sow uncertainty around the election by the president and everyone on down. They seize on moments like that because they know that's when we're most vulnerable, and it's easiest to use forms of, whether it be hacks and other forms of sort of cyber terror, or other attempts to undermine our infrastructure. And this is all part of a very deliberate tactic. It's not one that is exclusive to foreign actors, although we've certainly seen it as you described, including in the hospital attacks, cyber attacks that we've seen over the last few days. But it's also a tactic that domestic extremists use, intended to target our infrastructure. We saw neo-Nazis target hospitals at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. A member of one of our defendant organizations tried to bomb a hospital in Missouri that was treating patients. Another tried to burn down an assisted living facility. And we've seen over and over again discussions of attacks on our power grid. And it's all part of this, in some cases, sort of accelerationist idea that by speeding about the collapse of our infrastructure and society, these extremists can also speed about their vision for a very hateful, vile future for this country, whether it be through civil war.
Let's talk about how activists are stepping up right now to thwart these kinds of political intimidations.
There are so many people doing great work, and we have a resource page on our website at integrityfirstforamerica.org where we've been rounding up some of the great research and work that is being done, everyone from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights to the Anti-Defamation League to many others in between, who are using every tool we have at our disposal, whether it be the justice system or the fundamental GOTV efforts that have been central to winning campaigns to ensure that these attempts to intimidate and terrorize voters are not successful. And I think it's so important that all of us take this to heart, that this is what these extremists want. They want to scare us into not using our rights, to not exercising our rights, and we can't let them be successful. We need to show up, vote, help your friends and family vote. It is exactly what they want, to undermine this most fundamental part of our democracy. We cannot let them win. We need to be smart about it. We need to take action as needed, but we cannot let them win by letting intimidation, terror, and disinformation scare any of us from exercising this most fundamental right.
I think it's really important that you came on with us today, and I really appreciate it. I really like to inform people that they're being disinformed and not to believe the hype, as they say. Yes, these events are actually happening, but not in as greater than we've ever seen in the United States, but maybe not in as great as, and then they're getting tons of media coverage, but maybe not in as great as number and as impact as to thwart an entire election, at least not at this point.
Exactly.
Thanks.
And I think, exactly. And I very much appreciate you all shedding light on this, and hope folks continue to make sure their friends and family know what's at stake and how these tools and tactics are being used so that we don't fall for them.
Amy Spitalnick, Executive Director of Integrity First for America, the nonpartisan civil rights nonprofit, backing the landmark lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for Charlottesville. Thank you so much for the work that you do. You can follow Amy on Twitter at Amy Spitalnick, SPITALNICK, or at Integrity for USA. Thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
I'm Julianna Forlano. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to please subscribe to our channel. We're going to be working hard to give you information to fight the disinformation that you might be getting in a number of other outlets, shall we say. You can follow me on Twitter at Julianna Forlano. Also follow ACT.TV across platforms. Like a video, share a video, all the stuff that everyone says who's on YouTube. If you're watching on any of the other platforms, stay tuned. There's more to come in this program.